Well, thank you, Lorenzo, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and actually a honor being here. Actually, attended this course in 2005. It looks like another life, so it's quite a long time ago. So very happy to be here again. So, well, I decided to go for a very bold title. I hope that the presentation actually will meet the expectations, let's say. So, and I will start telling you about a symposium and a special issue that happened a long time ago. Actually, the symposium was held at the National Cancer Institute in April 1985. A long time ago, and the proceedings were later published in 1987 in the Journal of Chronic Diseases, and the symposium was organized by Duncan Thomas, primarily, with many other people, and it was about time-related factors in cancer epidemiology, and I'm starting with this because, of course, Rodolfo Saracci was involved as associate guest editor. I really regret that he's not here because I wanted to ask him about this. Why this is so special? First of all, I wish I was there because there were the best, let's say, researchers at that time on methodology in epidemiology. Sander Greenland was there, Jamie Robbins was there, and many others in addition to Duncan Thomas, Harvey Checkaway, many others. I mean, you read and you say how they could put so many people, bright people in the same room. And the reason I'm interested in this is because this symposium discussed the development about a concept, which is exposure time response. And the idea is quite simple. You are exposed to something, your risk is not immediate, it's delayed in time. And when you are exposed to different kind of levels of exposures during time, then it starts being very difficult to say how your risk develops in time. So it's a very general concept, but it's, I would say, neglected in methodological research, given it's important. Of course, there are many researchers dealing with this, but probably not as much, not as many that you expect. And of course, this was about cancer epidemiology, but my idea today is also to say this is not limited to cancer epidemiology. It's actually a general concept. So from a methodological perspective, why it's so difficult? And one of the reasons can be that everybody works in their own setting and their own field. So all the approaches are very specific to the research area and study design. The methods are quite ad hoc, I would say. For example, think about smoking. The idea is to mix, most of the times, duration, intensity, and times since cessation to explain a complex pattern of risk in time. So it's a kind of set of proxies. You're not really modeling the real thing. Then there is the definition of common concepts. So everybody knows about cumulative exposure, lagged exposure, exposure windows, but it's inconsistent across fields, and it's also a problem of terminology. For example, a working time series analysis, I call something lag. Somebody working in cancer epidemiology, in some instances, can talk about latency, but it's exactly the same concept. So there's a lack of a general and unified conceptual first, and then analytical framework. So let's start with the first. Let's try to build something general for this endeavor. And we start with the conceptual representation. So let's assume we have something very simple, a single exposure event. It happens at time t. And of course, what you expect is that this risk is delayed in time following a pattern. And of course, you can measure it at different times, and you see then the risk, for example, initially increases and then vanishes in time. Of course, the shape of this can be different. The problem is that this works in some setting. For example, there's a big study called Lifespan Study, which is about the survivors of the atomic bomb. Easy. You have a single event, you follow people in time, and you measure the risk. And time, since that single event is your variable of interest, let's say. But in real life, we are exposed to multiple events or episodes exposures at different intensity. So you can expect that the risk develops in time in a more complex way. A way to look at that is to reverse the perspective. Instead of taking a forward, I take a backward perspective, and my risk at time t is explained by multiple exposures at time t minus L, let's say, which is time since exposures to all the different exposures. And all the different exposures contribute differently depending on when they happened in the past. Now, it looks easy, but if you take this perspective, you need to make some assumptions in order to model it. And there are two assumptions. I'm not sure this has ever been discussed, actually. I'm presenting today, but I never discussed it myself in my papers. And these two assumptions are, first assumption of stable effect, meaning whenever you are exposed, that kind of risk pattern is the same. And the other one, probably more important, is the assumption of independency, meaning an effect of an exposure at a given time is not modified by other exposures either before or after. And this is a very, we can call it the fundamental assumption, which probably is rarely met, but this is the way. Now, if you are happy with these assumptions, you can start building an analytical framework that is more general. And of course, they can be relaxed in some ways, but it's not easy. So at the moment, let's stay with these two assumptions. So we can merge these two perspectives and build a single conceptual representation in which you have both the forward or the backward perspective, in which your risk is modeled by different contributions from past exposures, each one weighted by this curve, which is what you want to model, actually. So how your risk develops in time, and in doing that, you define a new dimension, which is exactly what Duncan Thomas was talking about. Instead than time, I call it lag, probably because I worked a lot on time series analysis. And therefore, there's a lag dimension that is different from the usually exposure response we are usually deal with. Now, this concept is not new, of course, not that bright. And actually, there were models for dealing with that. And I think the most developed were developed in econometrics. Actually, there's a paper by Almond, 1965, presenting these distributed lag models. I will talk about that later on, but it's already almost 60 years ago, so it's a long time. And the idea is very simple, is to reconstruct this curve. They were talking about capital appropriations and expenditures. So you have a capital appropriation here, and your risk, your expenditure increases in time and then decreases back to the normal. So it's exactly the same concept, but in econometrics. Not surprisingly, somebody thought about applying it in epidemiology. And actually, we should actually pay a homage to Joel Schwartz, who in 2000 actually applied exactly the same method to model air pollution and mortality. And the idea is the same. You are exposed to a spike, let's say, in air pollution now, and your risk develops in the future. And it's exactly the same lag curve that you are trying to model. But you look at the literature, and we rarely do. I work in time series analysis. My literature is the time series literature. I don't look at anything else. But if you come as a came originally from cancer epidemiology, you knew that this concept was already addressed in there. And for example, there were some papers looking at occupational epidemiology, and Hauptmann here developed exactly the same concept in a longer time frame. So we are not talking quarters or days. We are talking about years, actually, decades. But it's exactly the same. You are exposed to radon, and you develop a risk of lung cancer in the future. It's exactly the same thing. Of course, more broadly used in cancer epidemiology, for example, this paper by Richardson, smoking and leukemia, exactly the same thing. So the same problem addressed independently in different fields. And finally, of course, also in pharmacoepi or clinical epi. So here, the work by Michelle Abramovich, big name in this setting, benzodiazepines and fractures. So you are exposed to a drug, and your risk of fractures increases first and then decreases back to normal. Exactly the same thing. So similar question, concepts and analytical schemes, but surprisingly developed completely independently by different researchers in different areas. Probably unbiased, but I should say the DLM framework developed in econometrics is possibly the better developed analytically or statistically, if you want, if you compare to the other methods. But of course, somebody can argue with me. But I'll stick with that, and I'll try to say, okay, let's try to develop further the distributed lag model. So I start with a very general model. Don't be scared about the algebra. The idea is that your risk or hazard here is explained by a baseline hazard, a function modeling your exposure of interest x, plus other functions for adjusting for confounders. So very simple. The main limitation of this model, which is a usual representation, is that you just link your risk at time t as the exposure at time t, or confounders. Of course, this rarely happens, so you need to develop your function for the exposure in terms of an exposure history. So also accounting for previous exposure, and we do that every day. So for example, you can have an exposure history along this lag period, x minus L, previous day or previous year or whatever is your lag unit. And usually when you talk about cumulative exposure, it's just the sum of these exposures. We use something very similar in time series, which is the moving average. That is the average of your previous exposure. It's exactly the same thing, just rescaled. So how distributed lag models fit in this? Basically, it's a very elegant framework that models this exposure history in a more flexible way. Basically, it develops a function that I call W for this new dimension of lag L. And basically, this function is used to weight the previous exposures. So it's exactly the function modeling this shape, explaining how your risk develops in the future, or the weights of past exposures, taking a backward perspective. So forget me about this. I couldn't help myself by adding some more algebra, but the story of this is that it's very simple to compute, and eventually you end up with a series of transformed variables that you can stick in a normal, standard model, and you just fit your model. It's very simple, and this is an application, for example. The idea is that you can model, in time series in this case, ozone, daily ozone exposures and mortality, and the idea is that you can model this development in lag, meaning in the future, or weighted past exposures, with different functions. In this case, it's an unconstrained model, meaning I simply add a term or coefficient for each lag in the past. So it's very easy, completely flexible, but of course, very imprecise. And the idea is that actually you can use different functions. For example, here I put a spline function, which is a smooth function that constrain this shape in a way as my function for modeling this complex temporal pattern, and I can see that the estimates are more precise because of this assumption about constraining this curve. And this is very simple. How you interpret it, you are exposed to something, well, to a certain increase in ozone here, and your risk develops in the future. You stay at a higher risk if compared to somebody non-exposed up to day 6 or day 7. This is what the model tells you. Now, of course, it can be more complex than this, meaning we cannot always assume that the exposure response, which is the other dimension, is linear. And not surprisingly, I guess somebody has already thought about that. One of the first was actually Ben Armstrong, who I was lucky enough to work with him on this methodology, which is the distributed lag nonlinear model, meaning distributed lag for nonlinear exposure responses. Now, it becomes a bit more complex because the association now is bidimensional, meaning changes depending on the intensity of the exposure and the lag. So you have this bidimensional let's say, shapes. Again, probably not surprisingly, but somebody has thought about something similar in cancer epidemiology. So Kiros Berhane in 2009 developed pretty much the same model to model radon and lung cancer along years instead than days, as Ben did. So again, exactly the same concept, but in different fields. Now, in here, you can see below that algebraically can be a bit complex, but the underlying idea is very simple. I have now two functions. You remember WL, modeling the effect along lag. Now you have a function G, modeling your exposure response. You combine them, and you get a bidimensional exposure lag response. And notice the difference if compared to what Duncan Thomas termed as exposure time response, because the actual dimension is lag, is not time, meaning times since a certain exposure. And you can model all of these, and actually the choice, this model can be complex to parameterize the transformations, but eventually the idea is very simple. You choose a function to model the exposure response, you choose a function to model the lag response, and you are done. And this is what you get. This is an example in temperature and mortality, so you get this surface. This surface can be interpreted as a change in risk depending on a certain temperature, so intensity of exposure. This is the usual dimension we are used to, the exposure response. But in addition to this lag response, which is how the risk develops in time. So you read this, you interpret this as for hot temperature, your risks increase abruptly on the very first day you are exposed to something, and that decreases in time. For cold effects, the lag pattern is different. Initially, no risk, but the risk then starts kicking in later in time. And if you cumulate across this lag, you obtain the so-called overall cumulative exposure response, which is the net effect, the total effect accounting for this delay in the effects. Now, of course, this method has some advantages, mostly because it's very flexible, so you can model very complex dependencies. It's based on a consistent conceptual framework, so you have this idea about how to interpret this forward risk, meaning you are exposed today and my risk develops in the future, or my risk today is the sum, the accumulation of contributions for past exposures, each of them weighted by this curve. Of course, also the other good thing is that there's a full statistical development, and actually you can fit all of these with standard regression models. We'll see later. Now, the problem is that this was initially only applicable in time series studies. And of course, for me, it was everything because I'm working on that field, so I have this methodology, I'm very happy with that. But if you have a different kind of data, then this wasn't applicable. Of course, some similar developments were available, but one of the common issues, there was no statistical software implementation. So basically, you have to develop all of this on your own, and you eventually don't use it. So even if the core of the methodology is there, it hasn't been extended. So the idea is to generalize it and try to apply it more generally, in a way more broadly, in different fields. I was very keen to discuss about this exposure lag response association as a general thing. So if you look at the previous algebra, it doesn't depend on a time series structure, apart from the fact that the exposure history is defined as a time series, meaning I'm continuously exposed to something, but I approximate this, and you can see the approximation that instead of using an integral, I use a sum of specific exposure episodes. So, for example, you're thinking about air pollution, you can take the daily exposures in the past. I'm exposed to something today, to something yesterday, to something 2 days ago. So I built this sequence, basically, of exposures. The same actually can be done with anything, radon or smoking, okay? Yearly exposures, because the time scale is much longer, so the approximation can be rougher, let's say. So I take the exposure to radon on average this year, the previous year, 2 years ago, up to 40 years ago, maybe. So the idea is to reconstruct these series of exposure histories. And basically, I can do that in time series neatly, meaning I have a vector which is in my series. I take the lagged exposures as a vector. I just take lag 1, lag 2, lag 3. It's a series. It's already ordered. And I obtain for each observation what is your lag 1, lag 2, lag 3 exposure. However, I can do it in any setting, saying for each observation, I can reconstruct independently these past exposures. Of course, it's more complex because it's not done automatically, and each observation has an independent exposure history from the other ones. They don't depend on each other. But I can do exactly the same, and eventually I have the so-called matrix of exposure history, Q, which is something very simple. For each observation you have, so you have n subjects, for example, in your study, or n, let's say, units in your analysis. For each of them, you should be able to reconstruct these on the rows, these exposure histories. If you're able to do so, basically the distributed lag models or distributed lag nonlinear models framework works smoothly without any change, and all the interpretation and everything is exactly the same. So the idea is that you can use it in all the study designs as data structure you have. Let's have an example. In time series, which is the original one, it's very simple. So you have an observation at time t. Automatically, you can derive your exposure history in the past. So let's say that going on top is just like going backward in time. And you can lag this series easily, and you obtain exactly your matrix of exposure in histories. And actually, in time series is we can call it a case-only or self-matched studies, meaning you just compare risks at different times and exposure at different times within the same series, and you obtain your estimator, let's say. However, there are other study designs. If you work, as I do in environmental EPE, case crossover is the individual level counterpart of the time series. One of the problems in time series is always applied with aggregated data. Case crossover, not. You can apply it as with individual data. It's the same concept, self-matched, meaning instead of looking at times, for example, of the number of deaths in a place, if compared to another day, is just the individual risk at a given time compared to another time in the same individual. This is powerful because you automatically remove any confounding for between subject differences, and the concept is exactly the same. The comparison is within subjects, so you can have multiple subjects, and each of them is compared to itself, let's say, at different times. However, you can move to the case control, in which you have actually, it's a between study, between subject comparison. So you compare subject A with subject B and C. Subject A is the case, the other two are the controls. For each of them, you can reconstruct an exposure history, and it's a between subject design, so completely different confounding risks, let's say, but the concept is the same. And then you can go to the cohort, which is actually a case control with the full population, let's say, meaning each subject can be sampled different times. So for example, subject A act as a control in this risk set for subject B, who's the case, but later in time is the case in himself, and he has another control, another subject as a control. But again, for each of them, you can reconstruct the previous exposures, and actually each subject can have exposure histories at different times. The same, of course, you switch to a longitudinal in which everything is compared with everything, and of course, it's a more complex setting, but the same applies. You can still reconstruct these exposure histories. Now, once you have done it, you can apply this distributed lag nonlinear models methodology in different settings. And here, I'm presenting a few applications with the idea to present this framework in strikingly different study designs, type of outcomes and exposure data, and of course, a regression method that are linked with the kind of design you are doing. So I will start with something that has been already presented in the literature, which is the case in cancer epidemiology. So for somebody like me, coming from a time series setting in environmental epi, everything is a matter of short-term effects of pollution, temperature, environmental factors. So I'm just looking at days, maximum weeks. In here is a completely different setting. You are exposed to radon, for example, occupationally, and your risk of lung cancer develops in years, decades, but it's exactly the same process. So I took this data, which is from these Colorado Plateau miners, uranium miners, which are old cohort used a lot in methodological analysis. For example, Duncan Thomas, Brian Langholz, many have used this cohort for this purpose. They were basically working between the 50s and the 60s in mines in Colorado, and among these cohort of slightly, 3,347 subjects, there were at a certain point in time as a follow-up, 258 lung cancer deaths. The good thing of this cohort is that the exposure history was reconstructed. Of course, this is not common, especially for old cohorts, but in here you had it at a 5 years age period. So you start from age, I think, 15, because somebody was that young when they started, and then you say, okay, every 5 years on average each year, they are exposed to this, and they use these working level months, which is a special intensity measure for the exposure to radon, to measure it. And of course, interesting, they also measure the tobacco smoke intensity during that time. So the analysis is usually in a cohort, Cox proportional hazard model, so very different from the generalized linear models we use in time series analysis. Modeling, modeled using age as a time axis, controlling for smoking and calendar years. So I published this in this paper in 2014, and these are the results using different models. So I started in the first model assuming, you remember distributed linear models, complex parameterization, very simple choices. A function for the exposure response, a function for the lag response. I started simple, a linear function for the exposure response, so the risk is linear, and the lag response a constant function, meaning the risk is constant a long time. Now, I wanted to present this because this is actually cumulative exposure. Is exactly that definition, the sum of your exposures in the previous years, all of them weighted the same, but is a constant function. Of course, this can be relaxed, for example, taking a more flexible spline function for the lag response, so the risk, the exposure response still linear, but a curved relationship. I can relax even this using different functions. For example, I can use strata functions, step functions, for both dimensions of exposure response and lag response, or more flexible spline functions to model these risks. Now, let's have a look at this. How I interpret this curve is that the risk is modified depending on the intensity of the radon exposures for each year, and the lag, starting from lag 3, and I excluded the first 3 lags because I assume that exposure to radon in the last 3 years, they don't affect your risk of lung cancer today, so it's possible to implement these kind of assumptions, up to, lag 40. And what this tells me is that the exposure response is supralinear, I guess, meaning it starts attenuating at high radon exposures, while the lag response seems to suggest that the risk first increases, reaches a peak, and then decreases. And actually, if you cut this slice in this surface, you obtain this lag response curve, which is much easier to interpret, and it's telling you that your risk starts from 0. It peaks approximately 11 years after the exposure to that exposure to radon, and then it starts decreasing until it vanishes after 30 or 40 years. So exactly the same interpretation as before, and of course you can use different functions. For example, this is a piecewise or strata function to model exactly the same. It's just a choice of the function. Now, second example, I wanted to test it in a completely different setting. So, vaccine epidemiology. So you have this data set of 35 only children receiving the MMR vaccines. It was a big story some time ago about potential links with autism, and eventually it was debunked, but that's another story. But there are some side effects of this, and one of them is idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura. I don't even know if I got it right, but it's a kind of side effect that you can have after the vaccination. So you take these 35 children, the exposure history is actually very simple. It's a single event. So you don't need all this methodology, but I wanted to show that it's applicable also in this extreme setting. And then, of course, you follow up people, so you have the full exposure profile. You can reconstruct the exposure history at any time. The analysis is a conditional Poisson, controlling for age, and actually it was published by Whitaker in Statistics in Medicine 2006, applying a different approach with this self-controlled case series. It's a specific study design there, but even there, it's possible to apply this kind of distributed lag modeling, and if you do, you obtain this curve telling you that in days, your risk after vaccination starts increasing, peaks at about, 27 days, and then it starts decreasing, and after 40 days, your risk come back to normal. And of course, this is a very nice picture that can help a lot understanding the processes, underlying processes. Now, third example, this is my field, let's say, environmental stressors and allergic symptoms. But, as I said, so far, most of our applications of time series were limited to aggregated data. And of course, this is a big limitation because you cannot understand the potential effect of any individual characteristics. But the idea is to try to extend the framework also to individual level data, and nowadays easier because of all the technologies to reconstruct not just outcomes at the individual level, but also exposure. So this is an interesting smartphone study I collaborated with called A-Rater. Basically, these people took developed an app for a smartphone. They gave it to some participants, actually 1,601 participants, and all these participants, each day, they were replying to a question: have you had an allergic symptom? Which kind of symptom? Plus other information. But the good thing of this is that through this, we know that they are following us every time, but for once it's for good, meaning you can geolocate people every time, and you can reconstruct the exposure profile, linking these to spatial temporal maps. So basically, you end up having this complete series of exposures, environmental exposure for all the people. And actually, you think about this 10 years ago, it was, this is not possible, it's not feasible. So again, you extend this by developing this, what I call case time series, meaning it's a time series, but for individual data. And actually, this is a single subject. So you have the subject reporting an allergic symptom or not at different times. And for each of them, you have exposure to pollen, PM2.5, which is particulate matter, a specific pollutant, and temperature. And you apply exactly the same method. Actually, you apply different, I call it cross-basis parameterization, basically this DLNM parameterization, and you end up having results for each of the 3 stressors, showing you that this is the exposure lag response for pollen, meaning the risk in the exposure response increases first and then starts leveling down. In the lag, you have some lagged effect up to lag 3, maybe 3 days, after a high exposure to pollen, and this is the risk of having allergic symptoms. Actually, it's an odd ratio, because I model it as a logistic regression. For PM2.5, I took the assumption of a linear exposure response, consistently with the literature, so I simplified the model. And in this case, it's telling me that, of course, the risk is linear, and it's there. And this is what I call the cumulative risk, meaning taking into account all the effects along lags. But along lags, I can look at them here, and I found that actually only exposure to the same day is relevant, while the exposure at lag 1, lag 2, lag 3, meaning exposure yesterday, 2 days ago, and 3 days ago, they don't seem to be very important for modeling the risk. And this is temperature. Of course, the risk is more complex, meaning you have effects of heat, but maybe some suggestion of effects of cold, so a kind of non-linear exposure response. And again, you have a delay in the risk in the future. Now, the 4th and last example is about an unpublished analysis. And it's about cancer epidemiology, and it's a case control study. It's actually 3 case control studies pooled with a total of 1,479 cases and 1,918 controls, so quite a lot. But again, the good thing of this is that it was possible to reconstruct the yearly exposure to tobacco smoke a cigarette day for each of them. So you apply a logistic regression, so again, a different study design, but still the same process, controlling for sex. And these are the results, meaning in the exposure response, you have again this supralinear shape, meaning your risk starts increasing for smoking up to, let's say, to 20 cigarettes. You believe me, there are people smoking 80 sometimes each day. And but then it starts leveling up. I mean, adding, in a way, intensity doesn't add up the risk as much. But in terms of lag exposure, again, I can cut a line, and it's in here. Your risk increases, I would say, quite abruptly, peaks before 10 years, but then starts vanishing, but quite slowly in time. And trusting this analysis, it vanishes completely only after 50 years. I'm showing this example because I want to show why this can be so important. Because if you have this model, then you can build a kind of dynamic prediction of risks. Meaning, given your past exposure, your exposure history that changes every year as time passes, because lag 1 will become lag 2 next year, and so on, you're able to model how the risk develops depending on a certain exposure profile. So I took an example of somebody smoking up to, I think it was 30 cigarettes for the first 5 years, then decreasing to 15, I guess, or 10, then stopping, but then starting again. It's a relapse, as they call it in smoking epidemiology, for a certain period until the final cessation. From the model, I can reconstruct his dynamic risk in the future as an odds ratio, which starts increasing. It peaks much later after the quitting because of these lagged effects. And of course, you have a decrease and then an increase again because of this period, but it peaks later, and of course, it goes to 0 only after a very long time. So from this model, it's possible to reconstruct exactly these kind of patterns based on the assumptions that I mentioned at the beginning. So I conclude with I think, an important part of the research, which is software implementation. Because of course it's very nice to show all these graphs, but if somebody wants to do it, it doesn't have to, to go through all the algebra and implementation in a software because it's already there. But the good thing of this is that it's very simple because I developed a package called DLNM. And in this package, there is this function cross basis. This is actually the full analysis, if you want, well, after data preparation, for the radon example. So you have a matrix Q, which is your exposure history for each subject. Actually, is a Cox proportional hazard model. It implies that you have already expanded the data with your risk set. So you have each case and controls within each risk set already defined. For each of them, you develop these exposure histories. You have this matrix, and then you define a lag, let's say lag 2 to 40. So you exclude the first 2 years of exposures, up to 40 years, the maximum lag. And then you have these two arguments to define which kind of function you want to apply for the lag response, which is this, and another function for the exposure response. And in this case, I use these B-splines, quadratic, with certain knots. So it's kind of technical, but the idea is that you define these smooth functions in here. Then you fit the model with the usual standard Cox pH function in R, so you don't need a proper function, just including the object that you derive this with these cross bases. Then you obtain the predictions with these other functions, and you plot them. I mean, you get the graphs that I showed previously, and this can be easily interpretable. So all of this works in any kind of setting. You have just to reconstruct this Q, apply this function, and apply different kinds of models so it's potentially applicable in any study design. So I'm very bad usually writing the last slide of my presentations. The conclusions are, sometimes I left it blank because I think it's self-explanatory, but I should say that this offers a flexible way to model complex temporal dependencies. The good thing is that it's based on a very clear conceptual and analytical framework, so you know the assumptions, you know how to interpret the effect summaries, etc. And of course, being extended now, it offers the possibility of being applied to many different settings. So I left here some links, for example, some example of our code and the R package. And if you have questions that you don't want to ask now, feel free to drop me an email and I'll be happy to reply. Okay, thank you.